Fabulous. So welcome everyone and thank you. Welcome to our 2024 March History Club. My name is Joe Walsh. I'm the Development Officer with the LGBTQIA+ Heritage Project. This project is in partnership with the Rainbow Project, Here and I, and Cara Friend, who we're going to be talking about tonight. And the project is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And this year, 2024, is a very important year for the LGBTQIA+ sector as a whole, as we're celebrating 100 years of queer activism between the three sector organisations. And tonight, we're looking at the history of Cara Friend, who turns 50 this year, making it them the oldest. And but certainly the person we're speaking with is young Adam Murray, who's not the oldest in the room tonight. And Adam is the Community Development Manager with Cara Friend. And Adam has a presentation for us to watch and is going to cover some history and highlights of Cara Friend from the beginning. Welcome, Adam, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak on History Club.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for coming along tonight. As Joe said, my name's Adam Murray. I'm the Community Development Manager with Cara Friend. It's a real honour to get an opportunity to speak to you tonight, and I'm just going to launch, if it's okay, straight into a presentation that I hastily threw together when asked to speak to you today. So I'm just going to try and, it's been a while since I've done this on Zoom, so forgive me if this takes a second. Okay, and play. Can everyone see the screen, the slideshow?
Yep.
Okay. So, Cara Friend at 50, as Joe said, 2024 is Cara Friend's 50th anniversary. It's a huge anniversary for us, and it's actually a year of anniversaries for our entire community. The Rainbow Project, I think, turns 30 this year. I think Here and I turns 25. I know Queerspace just recently turned 25, and I think Pride also had a big birthday recently. So it's very much the presentation, while it will look at Cara Friend, it will also slightly touch on the wider community and the celebrations of this big year. So a bit about me. I'm blessed actually that a lot of people here at the History Club do know me as friends, colleagues, and Cara Friend compatriots. And I really do feel very blessed to work in this community and to work for Cara Friend and to know so many of you here. A bit about myself. I started life with Cara Friend about 14, maybe 13 or 15, but about 14 years ago. It's great to actually be speaking to the History Club because history was my favorite subject in school. And after I left secondary school, I went to do Queen's to study history, but I had just come out. I had a very unsupportive friend base that I carried over from secondary school, and one day after one of them was quite rude and homophobic to me, I turned to them all and said, I don't need you people in my life, and I burned my entire friend group to the ground, which was maybe not wise, but it was the only thing I could do in that moment to preserve my own sanity somewhat. So unfortunately, that led then to me trying to find my own community. And I did what most young people at the time probably did. I went to the likes of the bars and the nightclubs. And I picked up a lot of drinking friends and I picked up a lot of drinking habits. I dropped out of Queen's, unfortunately. I never got that degree. But one of the huge turning points in my life was when in one of the bars I bumped into another young person who asked me, have you heard of Glenny, as it was at the time, Gay Lesbian Youth Northern Ireland, and have you heard of Cara Friend? And I said no, and they encouraged me to go to the youth group. So that led to me going to Cara Friend's youth service, which used to meet in cathedral buildings just around the corner from the Kremlin, if you know it, on Donegal Street. Unfortunately, that building was recently lost in a fire. But I attended the youth group for quite a while then, and I eventually said I'd like to volunteer for Cara Friend. And at the time they said, well, we have enough youth work volunteers. I guess we can stick you in the office. And Cara Friend at that time had one staff member. It was the director, Steve Williamson, who's still our director today. And basically for about half a year, I just went in. Cara Friend would reimburse my bus tickets each month, and I would go in and do some admin work until eventually they hired me 10 hours a week to do admin. That then led to full-time employment and eventually being able to escape the day-to-day humdrum of admin, which after 8, 9 years did become a little bit grating, so I got into community development. And I'm really, really lucky that my interest in history has actually managed to find me in this role with Cara Friend, as over the last 5, 6 years, history has increasingly become history and heritage, and the exploration of those have increasingly become part of my job. And really speaking to you today about that is kind of a culmination in a lot of ways, and I'm very proud of that. So I'm not going to teach my granny how to suck eggs. I know that a lot of the people here will know Cara Friend, know it longer than I will, know it more like from first-hand experience than I know it. So I'm not a historian, never got that degree, but I am going to try and give you some information that will be of interest and just give you a broad overview. So if I get anything historically wrong, please do let me know at the end. So Cara Friend, as I said, was set up in 1974 by members of the Gay Liberation Society based at Queen's University. And there's a really long history between Cara Friend and the university. And actually that continues into modern day work. So I think a big part of this year in the celebration will be going back to those roots and trying to explore that relationship as it's developed over time. And we'll actually look at, in some of the slides, we'll look at how that relationship developed and what Queen's was able to provide for Cara Friend and how that relationship existed. Initially, Cara Friend was set up as a PO box, really. It was a letter writing befriending service, and its focus was providing information and befriending, as they saw it, befriending. And I'm not sure if they knew at the time, but they certainly were actually laying down the groundwork, the framework for what we now call the LGBTQIA plus community. And they did that in the initial, by the very first thing, which was just connecting people to each other. And we'll see when we look later at some of the letters, we'll see what impact that had, because really that can't be overstated. That even just that service of connecting people to each other was what all of this has grown out of in a lot of ways. Our archive, the Cara Friend archive, is based at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, where at least 2,000 documents, I think, are currently held, and we'll talk a little bit about those in the part of presentation tonight. In 74, then, Cara Friend establishes a helpline. There's a sort of a start-stop. They establish a helpline at Queen's. This burns out the circuit board because hundreds of people try to call all at once, and then they have to go and get their own helpline. But that helpline, you see very quickly that the letter writing in the first 2 years is like they're bombarded with hundreds of letters, and then as soon as the telephone helpline comes in, that the number of letters sort of slows and steadies, whereas the number of phone calls absolutely shoots up. And there's an interesting part of our history that we've not really managed to explore, but I would really, I hope that we can at some point, because with the introduction of the internet and internet in everybody's home, what you see is the number of phone calls does that sort of decline and steady, whereas the number of emails rapidly shoots up. And also, never mind, social media contacts, online chat services, none of which is, we have the paper copies of all the letters. And we're really, really blessed, actually, that the founding members of Cara Friend, the early volunteers, the long-time volunteers, have preserved so much of Cara Friend's documentation from the 70s up to the early 2000s. But we are actually, I think, facing a bit of a challenge, perhaps, when it comes as a community to looking at our own history, that whenever the internet comes in, we don't have all those paper records anymore. So maybe we get to talk about that a bit more later on. Cara Friend, so it was set up primarily by people who were in the GLS and were political by nature. They were seeking law reform, but they recognized, and this was very much through interaction with other gay rights activists from across Ireland and the UK and further afield, they recognized the need for what we would now call basically a charitable model, a service provision model. But they were, whilst providing those vital life-saving services such as befriending and information provision, they were also similarly fighting alongside NIGRA and others for the decriminalization of homosexuality, which, again, I don't need to tell anyone at a history club, an LGBTQI plus history club, but you know some of the story there. But one thing that I am looking at in terms of celebrating this year is, I think everybody kind of knows about the Dudgeon versus the United Kingdom case, but not a lot of people, at least certainly as a 35-year-old gay man myself, I don't know a lot about the detail of that case and its context in the broader movement across Europe, because this wasn't the first time someone tried to take a case to get decriminalization. It wasn't the first time a case went to the European Court. Many were slapped down beforehand. So there's actually a lot still to learn, I think, that in terms of educating the community and the wider public about that specific case. And I would probably, if I jump around the timeline, by the way, later on in this, I know I'm laying down some sort of like 76, 82, 99. I will jump around a little bit once we get past this overhead. But they established Gay and Lesbian Youth Northern Ireland in 1999, now renamed Cara Friend LGBTQIA plus Youth. And actually, when putting this together, I actually realized that originally the ampersand wasn't there, and they had to have a whole series of meetings about whether or not to add the ampersand. So much preserved in terms of the history. But and that was my in for Cara Friend, as I mentioned, was through the youth service, which continues today. And when I went to the youth service, there was one group. It was in Belfast. There was about 20 of us. We were all sort of university age. We'd all just come out. Fast forward to 2024, there are well over a dozen groups right across Northern Ireland, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young people moving through these services every year, and they are not all university age. Actually, the majority of our service users now are sort of in the 12 to 16, maybe 16 to 19 range. So Cara Friend delivers a whole range of services. I'm sure many of you will know some of them. I'm actually going to go into a bit more detail on them later on, so I'm not going to read all of those out now, but you can see there's a diversity of services. We are sometimes, and I think it's maybe a problem from our own success in how well we've engaged with youth work in schools, that often we're sometimes pigeonholed as the youth group or the young people group, which really is not the case. But that is probably what most people would know us for today. So the background in the earliest efforts. So I'm not going to read all of this, but one of the great things that we have in terms of like primary materials is Cara Friend's annual reports going from 74 pretty much to the modern day. Certainly the ones from 74 to I think the early to mid 2000s, if not maybe a little bit later, actually maybe 2010s, are preserved and are in the Public Records Office, where they can be accessed. They can also be accessed through Queens, who have digitized them. And we're going to have to look at other ways of preserving them and sharing them and getting them out there. But that the first annual report really blew me away whenever I read it, because it's not, as in the modern day, a lot of annual reports are kind of like, they're kind of seen as like a legal requirement you just have to get through the business of. It's like, okay, who's elected, who, appoint a financial, an auditor and all these sorts of things. The original Cara Friend, actually all of the Cara Friend annual reports are incredibly narrative and incredibly detailed, and all of them really tell you the story of the community in a lot of ways. So this first ever Cara Friend annual report even goes into lay down, talks about Kinsey, as you can see there. It talks about the situation in Northern Ireland and the broader EEC as it was before it was the EU. It talks about the states and whatnot. It talks about criminalization. It talks about where some countries, where we still have criminalization, some countries, even like Holland, Denmark, and Norway, are having homosexuality mentioned in sex education in schools. So there's this huge disparity between Northern Ireland and other places. They go in to talk about the situation regarding, the medical community are slow to understand that this isn't an illness, that it's not an illness in that sense. And we'll see actually what you see from a lot of the letters that Cara Friend received. That's the context that people have grown up with. They talk about homosexuality as my problem or my condition. That's also very common. People say, I've come to accept my condition. And that's language that now we sort of don't use, but you can see where people's heads were at the time. So Cara Friend talks in its initial thing about the background, the situation, and then goes on to talk about the origins. So it's against this backdrop that Cara Friend was born, and it was an information and befriending service. And it talks about how they did try to operate a separate first sort of starter service called Cara, which operated for exactly 1 week in April 1974. But because there were hundreds of calls coming every hour, the university were like, nope, you have to shut this down. You have to get your own phone. So one of the things that you'll see is there's that very first start, but they don't let that stop them whenever they run into this problem. Actually, they continue to really build momentum incredibly quickly. And one thing before I move on actually is, even again, just as I was putting together this presentation, I noticed on that smaller excerpt, see the little university watermark? I'd never noticed that before. I've looked at that document a million times, but I never noticed that watermark at the bottom, where it's just underneath where it says presented in a report of the well-publicized meeting university. So again, that tells us something. It tells us either they were typing this at the university on typewritten paper, or maybe they nicked the paper, I don't know. But it tells us something. We just don't know exactly what it tells us, but we can understand. So the first annual report, as I say, Cara Friend is born. It's defined as a voluntary information and befriending service of homosexual and bisexual men and women. And it's interesting that the word lesbian is not included there, but again, members of this history club will understand language changes. And so whilst there'll be other language that'll be mentioned in this, such as transvestite and transsexual, which eventually becomes TVTS, this is the language of the time. And even homosexuality, I'm using this in the context of the document. We wouldn't refer to members of the community as homosexuals per se, but that's the language of the time. And again, even in that very first excerpt, it says to provide social support in helping people to come to terms with their sexuality, which is also interesting language. You know, it's in that sort of, this is even these people who are so proactive and so trying to be positive, they're still sort of in that mindset of this is something to come to terms with, or at least that's where people are at, and if they wish, integrating into the gay social scene. And that's one of the really interesting things about early Cara Friend, is the way they talk about social integration and sort of independence of people. So the befriending, in a lot of ways, that they provide is sort of like a pipeline. Sort of, you come in as a fresh new person, you'd go through befriending and support. You're then, if you're willing to, taken to an LGBT establishment such as a bar or a club, where they can introduce you to other people, and eventually you become independent to the point where you don't need the befriender anymore. You're integrated, as they call it. And one thing that's really interesting about the Cara Friend archive and the records is the way that they treat every individual with so much care. They're sort of tracking everybody and trying to make sure that everybody's okay. No one's a number in a lot of ways. They're concerned with the progression on this, social integration sort of model that they're using. And they say, so the very first meeting, there's 10 individuals. There's the first general committee. Some of those names very, very well known to myself. I imagine some of them, or most of them, known to most people here. But you've got Doug Sobey there, who's still very much in contact with Cara Friend and will be advising us hopefully over the course of the year and being involved in some of the events. Brian Gilmore, similarly, Brian even just this week has been sending me so many photos and scans, and he's sending out emails saying we must have cassettes and VHSs and Betamax. I'm not entirely sure what a Betamax is, but he's sure that they're out there. So we are starting to hopefully gather more and more of these materials. Even just this week, like I say, Brian sent me a photo of Jeff Dudgeon, who's also there, as you can see, and obviously took the case. But there's a photo of Jeff in 1975, I think, on a TV program with 300 other individuals, and I just was just so happy because I said, Brian, I've never seen that photo before. So the first committee, as you can imagine, they had quite a tall order in front of them. It's illegal. Homosexuality is illegal. The church, the state, the police forces, none of them are open or encouraged about the idea of change. People are scared. People are lonely. People are in the closet. Many are in relationships or marriages that they felt they had no choice but to enter into. But this first committee really throw themselves into setting up this organization, and they are very professional in the way that they do it as well. They're not seeking to be like a fringe organization. They really reach out to professional bodies, counselors, political figures. They reach out to a lot of people and say, like, we're here and this is our mission and we would like to engage with you about that. And they have some success, I have to say, over the even in the early days of engaging with professional bodies and like medical and educational professionals. Um, so we'll just go on then to in 1970. So that's again, there's 301 individuals in the first year who've been Cara Friend has been contacted by, and they go about tracking the sex, age, geographical area, the source, the results, and all that. And that's, again, it's in the appendixes. You can go and look at the Cara Friend annual reports, and they've tracked all the numbers and the demographic breakdown. It must have been quite some work, actually, to keep track of all these things over decades, but it's all there. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're even continuing to actually mine that data and extrapolate from that data even more information, so we can paint a more detailed picture, if that makes sense. As you can see, they break them down. Even 243 were in legitimate inquiries, because they do get a lot of hoaxes. They do get a lot of, like, people misunderstand what the organization's for. They see the word friend, and I'm sure everyone here knows that, you know, Cara being Irish for friend, friend in English being Cara in Irish and whatnot, that they chose that name very particularly in the 70s to show it's a cross-community organization. But that choice has led to, in the early days, and actually up until, you know, about a couple of weeks ago, we still get messages from people who think that we're either related to cars, care homes, or just friendship. So you do get people going, you know, I'm trying to arrange a care package, and it's like, nope. But it's interesting to me that I'm still getting those confused calls, and they get some in the early days. But anyway, of those 243 legitimate, they track, you know, that 87 were met by befrienders. Of those, there was a follow-up then with 54 attending the discos or meetings or going out to pubs, and then 28 become, as they call them, socially integrated. They don't need any further assistance from Cara Friend. So 301 contacts produces 28 social integrations, so to speak. It's not an easy task, but it is the beginning of community in a lot of ways. And for obviously understandable reasons, a lot of people in the early days connected in with Cara Friend and then didn't maybe get to that full level of social integration, because of, you know, the societal pressures, the fear of getting caught, which we'll see a bit more about later on. And they say there in the first year, 243 inquiry of the 243 inquiries, 2 were from transvestite, 1 from transsexual, and those numbers are important because we're about to just look at the next year. 37 women contacted Cara Friend in the first year, which is, you know, a shockingly low number given the overall numbers, but the follow-up rate was slightly higher. 17 of the 37 were met, and 13 went on in social contact. 10 became socially integrated. And it also references there that there was an established Sappho group in Belfast at the time. So one of the things that's interesting about those numbers is when you compare them then to year 2. So 1976, and don't worry, by the way, I'm not going to go through all 50 years. I'm just sort of giving a snapshot of the early days to show how rapidly the interest in Cara Friend sort of rose. Like from you see it from the get-go with the hundreds of people trying to call the line, but you also get it in the numbers as they are recorded by the diligent Cara Friend volunteers. So here you see a Niagara News page from 1976 in January. Cara Friend, homosexual information and befriending. So that's the first year as well when the helpline is brought in, as I mentioned. So 861 people get Cara Friend then in 76 to 77 compared to the 289 legitimate ones last year. In the 74 to 75, 75 to 76 was 289, then 532. But in any case, once you get to 76 to 77, you have 817 telephone calls and 44 letters, a huge difference. 139 seeking info, 616 seeking befriending. There's a presentation I put together for during the Past History Conference a while ago, using a sample of about 120 letters. And after having read them, I entitled the presentation "Letters from a Lonely Place," because what you see in like the seeking, the letters and emails and phone calls, sorry, letters and phone calls seeking befriending, is loneliness and isolation really shines through. People are writing to complete strangers, to an organization they have no idea about, and they're saying, I'm really lonely, I need a friend, I'm 5'9", I have blonde hair, I'm interested in this, that, and the other. And they, it's really like their only outlet. But also in that, once you get into the year 76 to 77, the number of women has also started to grow. And the number of, as they now call them at that point, TVTS, has grown from 3 to 25. And actually in that 76 to 77 year, there's also 2 parents who are contacting. And interestingly, they're contacting to say they suspect their sons might be gay and they want to know how to help them, which is really interesting. But again, they use terms like come to terms with your sexuality. An interesting thing I noted from the 77, I've mistyped that, 77 to 78 report, is that they note that there's a significant achievement in that Cara Friend has got premises. Again, it's coming back to Queen's Student Union at the university, and they get use of a semi-derelict house owned by the university. The Students' Union decided they didn't need it anymore, and they say that Cara Friend can use it. And it's noted in the report that Cara Friend says they're already in, and they're already decorating, they're already improving the house, they've connected the electricity, they've sorted out the plumbing. So it's interesting they've done all of this actually before even being given the use of the space, but they clearly really want it, and they get it. And so they introduce then telephone room, befriending room, and you wouldn't maybe call this like an LGBT center as we would now know it, but it's certainly one of the first, if not the first, and if anyone knows of another, they can correct me, but it's certainly the nucleus of what not that mission to get an LGBT space in the city specifically. And that Cara Friend was based there, and then I think, again, there's probably people who could correct me on this, but they moved to Carpenter. They had where the Carpenter Club was, and then there's the Cathedral buildings, and then there's the old War Memorial building, and now there's Cathedral House. So one of the parts of Cara Friend's story is also very much having to move around a lot, and sometimes that's because of rent going up, sometimes it's because of the success of the organization, they need to grow, and as some people here might be aware, we're working very closely with other organizations in the sector, like the Rainbow Project, like Here and I, to engage with City Council to try and get a 25-year lease, or to make a more permanent long-term LGBT centre in the city centre. So again, there's so much more information in the reports themselves, so I'll not belabor all of it right now because there's other slides. So with this rapid rise of interest in Cara Friend, and they do start to advertise, that's one thing I didn't put a slide in about, but it's quite interesting. In the first annual report, they say we wrote to, I think it's like 6 or 7 newspapers to try and place an advertisement, and all but one said no, and I think one particular newspaper said it would be obscene to do so. So there's also a huge project to look into the history of how the media have responded to our community and treated us over the years, and if they've learned any lessons. I certainly hope so. But as one young person said at an LGBT Awareness Week event that I helped organize a while ago, visibility can be very liberating, but it can also be a target painted on your back. And very much then, once you get, the interest rising in Cara Friend, the RUC starts to pay more attention. And the reports refer to that between January and June, I think it's 75, the RUC decides to raid Cara Friend. They took a total of 22 individuals in for questioning, including 7 of the male Cara Friend General Committee, because homosexuality was not illegal for females, because society, the powers that be at the time thought, well, women couldn't possibly do that. That's just absurd. So the one thing that really jumped out at me as well was that there were threats deployed that they would out these people to their families, to their employers, and they use these threats to try and obtain information that they can use then to prosecute men for having sex with men. And it's interesting that there's actually just been this very week, I think, isn't it, that there's Spotlight have done a program that it talks about the RUC in the context of the murder assassination of Darren Bradshaw. And I think that I haven't seen it yet myself, apologies, but I think they talk a little bit in that about the negative attitudes of the RUC. So the police, as well as arresting people, threatening them, trying to blackmail them essentially into becoming informants, they also seize documents. But thanks to the safeguards employed by Cara Friend very early on to have this level of strategic thinking, but they make sure that, letters are stored in one place coded, names are stored separately, so the police aren't actually able to use anything that they steal basically from the offices. And the Cara Friend team at the time basically say, whilst this has caused huge anguish and upset, and it's an outrage and whatnot, and they need to fight back, they say that they're very lucky that there wasn't further tragic consequences, because we do know that right across the world where the police have targeted members of our community and sought to punish them, arrest them, blackmail them, etc., it can lead to all manner of pain, including up to people taking their own lives. So they sort of recognize that they're very lucky, actually, despite the horrible thing that's just happened to them. They realize that it could have been so much worse. So I'm not gonna spend a huge amount of time on these, but we're just really lucky. These are in the NIGRA archives and can be accessed. So this is like newspaper clippings from the day, because like reports are really interesting, but sometimes the newspaper clippings are just so interesting to have a look at. And I always love that one, Save Ulster from Paisley. It talks about hysteria. Again, blackmale gays are easy prey. Keep gaiety out of Ulster, says Paisley. Some really, really interesting stuff there, and we're very, very, very lucky to have that and to be able to continue to use it. And as I mentioned, a lot of the people who are involved in the formation of Cara Friend also involved in NIGRA, working very closely with NIGRA, even if they're not members of both, but many of them are, and they work very closely on law reform, which, as you know, and other speakers can go into much more detail on, was achieved. Sorry, I just find those so amusing. That's a small girl saying, "I heard my dad say you don't believe in fairies, Mr. Paisley." Right. Sorry, there's more. There's always more. And that other one, if anyone knows, I always put this in when I can. If anyone knows what the Ulster Paranoid was, would they let me know at the end, please? Because I have no idea what its origins are, but I'd be really interested to learn more. So, Cara Friend continues. Oh, there's Brian trying to get in. Brian, very good. So you get more sort of into the day. You can see here from this leaflet that's been preserved that they do start to advertise there's actually two lines, and I think quite early on, actually after the formation of the helpline, quite early on, they recognize the need that some women will want to speak to women, and so they set up lesbian line, and then the Cara Friend line becomes gay helpline. And this is very recognizable to me. As I say, I came into Cara Friend about 14 years ago. This is quite recognizable to the period when I got involved in, and you can see the little logo down on the right hand side there, the triangle with the hands, I think. But this is the logo that Cara Friend had whenever I got involved, and as you can see, it is somewhat dated. I'm not sure who chose that. I'm not sure. They know they didn't design it. I know that that's a stock image, but that is whenever I got involved in Cara Friend. This is sort of 14, 15 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer. And you have Gay Helpline, you have Lesbian Line as it was, and you have Glenny, Gay Lesbian Youth Northern Ireland. Today, this is Cara Friend, the sort of the more modern design that was designed for us. And our services include youth services. So we have our own services, like the Belfast group is still going. It meets 3 times a week. It has 2 different age groups. It's so much more vibrant than whenever I was in it. It's got like a 12 to 16-year-old group, and they are the bolshiest, most outspoken young people you'll meet sometimes. Um, but I should also say, my colleague Maria coordinates a network of LGBTQI plus inclusive youth services right across Northern Ireland. As I say, involving hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of young people. We do a lot of work in the modern day about LGBTQI plus awareness training and all-out anti-bullying training. We have a team of 2 now. Again, that's a service that has grown so rapidly that we had to get a second staff member for it. We have trained, I think a while ago we celebrated, was it our 20,000th pupil trained or something like that? We've been in I think I'm not sure how many schools, but it's a lot. It's a lot more. I remember whenever we would write out to the schools and none would reply. And now they actually write to us saying there's out kids in our school and we need training, we need your support, we need to get you in. And that's just been really a societal shift in a lot of ways with the advent of the internet and young people finding each other and coming out younger and more loudly. So that's a really positive input. We have an LGBTQI plus mental health and mindfulness project through which young people can basically get a listening ear service through Zoom. That sort of sprung up as part of the pandemic, but has continued because it has been very successful with young people who can't make it to a youth group. The switchboard and helpline continues, and like I say, a lot of it now would be emails, but one thing that I've noticed over the last few years, particularly the last year, we're getting an ever increasing number of messages from people in North Africa, Afghanistan, Iran, the Middle East. The situation is getting so dire for so many of them that we are frequently contacted by people, and it's really thanks to volunteers. Like Cara Friend's always been it's like we went from 1 staff member to about 12 staff members, but we rely very much on volunteers and as well in a lot of ways. And I just want to personally thank Colin, who works very closely with me when it comes to supporting a lot of these people, and it's me usually forwarding them to Colin, who has the experience. So that's really appreciated. But that is, like, I think as a community, that's something we also need to have a look at, is this increasing helpline switchboard type need for people who are not actually here but are in even more dangerous, more desperate situations than any of us. The community development program is my own role. That involves, so I would help organize Holocaust Memorial in January out in the past, which we'll talk about a little bit soon. Awareness Week is coming up in May. My job is very much like a Frankenstein's monster of events organizing, advocacy, working in partnership with other organizations. So one day I could be answering helpline calls, the next day I could be doing a food poverty program, the next day I'm organizing Awareness Week. It keeps me on my toes, and every now and then a curveball comes where someone says, "Hey, do you want to speak to the History Club?" But that's great. We have inclusive schools and business charters, which is another sort of development in Cara Friend's way of doing things. Whereas the training very much came out of, will you let us come in and do a workshop like with some young people? Now we're seeing the need for more sustained change, and actually through the charters, we're encouraging workplaces and schools to set up like LGBT staff networks, LGBT Gay Straight Alliance type groups in their schools, and then they hold their employer or their school to account rather than relying on us coming in all the time. But we do a lot of work supporting those. And like all the LGBTQI plus charities, we do a lot of advocacy, campaigning, policy and volunteering. We were part of the marriage equality campaign. We're part of the ban conversion therapy campaign. And we work really closely with all LGBT organizations that will work with us, whether they're funded or they have staff or not. We're very much seeking to work in partnership. And so that's the next, actually, I knew that's why it was in my head, because that's the next thing that popped up. And we're very pleased. And we've always had a great relationship. Cara Friend's relationship, for example, with Queer Space goes back a very, very, very long time and continues to really thrive. And actually, as part of Outing Pass this year, I know that Queer Space will be giving a presentation. So if you only make one thing, make that. So as I mentioned earlier on, my own role in Cara Friend has increasingly involved the exploration of our history. And I'm just going to sort of talk about that a little bit and how we're exploring our history and our heritage. And then I'll just round off with a couple of upcoming events. So one of the things that really came to us rather than us going to look for it is actually a relationship with Queen's School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics. They contacted us, I think, in 2017 maybe, and said, look, we have all these masters doing a public history degree every year, and every year they have to do a 30-day placement. Would you be interested? And at the time, we were very much like, we wouldn't really know what we would have them do, and we don't know if there'd be any interest whatsoever. But okay, we'll come pitch about the Cara Friend and see if anybody's interested. And every year that we have pitched, every year there's been about 1 to 3 people who have shown an interest, and we're really, really lucky in that, because that has provided history-focused students time and energy. That was the first year where we had 3 students. Cathal there in the middle, I think, is still a member. It might be a member of this very history club. The first 3 students went through the archive of 1 to 1,500 letters and just tidied them, because whilst we were really lucky that the Cara Friend volunteers in the early days did, like, they anonymized them by cutting out names and addresses, and then they put them together in bundles. These went into Prony, but there was still a bit of work that needed to be done to chronologically lay them out. So those 3 students went through in 30 days they didn't just do the letters, they did everything. So they went through about 2,000+ documents, and they gave every one of them their own like code number, and made sure they were in chronological order. And Prony couldn't be happier, because they have a billion documents to work through, so any assistance they can get is really appreciated. My next group of students, both from the States actually, they went through then and indexed them all, and I'll show you that index in a little second, just briefly. And they went through all the letters and said, okay, what's the demographic data? Is a gender or a sex or a sexual orientation or a place or an age or whatever, is any of this mentioned? And if it is, let's capture it. And then they also identified like the thematic data, which was anything that anybody identifies as an issue and anything anybody asks for. And so whereas the early Cara Friend reports give us the overview of like, okay, in this year there was this many of this age, this many of that age, this many of this place. Now we're lucky to have an index at Prony that goes through every single individual letter. So if you wanted to say, I just want the letters from Newry, we could actually figure out how to do that. And then last year it was Becky, who's also from the States, and Becky went through the letters and did a great job. And that's just some, by the way. There's a small portion of the boxes of materials. It's not the whole archive, that's just some. But Becky went through and identified, okay, this letter's asking for info. This letter has a story to tell. This gives a lot of personal narrative information. And so we've really started to sort of figure out which ones could be used more for like cultural, historical, heritage events, trying to tell stories, trying to change hearts and minds. Again, it takes a lot of work. And actually, we have 2 students this year, one of which has just added 5 more years worth of letters that we found, that I found years ago when we were moving building, and people were saying, there's no storage space anymore. We need to make room. I was grabbing boxes of letters and going, these are staying with me. And some of them actually just lived under my desk for a long time because I didn't want anything to happen to them. So one thing I would say about whether it's any of these volunteers, or whether it's the current volunteers, they really have to be commended, because anyone who's worked with the Cara Friend archive, it is a huge emotionally taxing thing to read through, like hundreds and thousands of letters, reports, responses, and they're most of them, some of them are very funny actually, and the personality of the anonymous people shines through, but most of them, as you can imagine, are quite bleak. So actually, I just want to show you, if I can, very quickly, that index. In the Public Records Office, for anyone who doesn't know, it's just down in the Titanic Quarter, but you can see here isolation. This is going through the letters: isolation, loneliness, isolation, loneliness, isolation, loneliness, questioning identity, anxiety about family or friends finding out, isolation, loneliness, married, anxiety, the thematic stuff is not anything other than you would really expect. It's grim. The places is interesting. It's another one. So Belfast, Bangor, Ballymena, Buenos Aires, Portadown, Dungannon, Derry, France, Portrush, Dublin, Strabane, Fermanagh. You get them from all over, and we'll actually touch on this later on when we talk about some of the cultural events that we've used this material for. But you'll see that they get New Zealand, they get Chicago, for Tel Aviv, Scotland, Finland. Anyway, I could go through. I find that personally interesting. Before the internet, there were, some of you will remember, I actually remember them in the Cara Friend office. Was it called Atlas and things like that? There were these magazines, travel mags that went around advertising services. So that's one of the things interesting about Cara Friend is really, really early on, actually, the word gets out that there's this new LGBT organization, it's gay, a homosexual organization, and people start writing. And the Buenos Aires one, I think, is writing basically saying, I'd like a pen pal. But I actually thought we'd just pick out 2 letters to have a quick look at. So here's one from 1976. Dear Sir, I was so glad to see your advert in the Belfast Telegraph on Thursday night. I thought that I was the only person that felt this way, and now I know that you can point me in the right direction. I am so pleased. So please rush me any information you can without delay. I will be forever grateful. That's very typical, that sort of like a cathartic release of, I was alone and now I'm not so alone. I realize there's other people. And here's another one from 1976. I watched your program and I have decided that by writing to you and asking for your advice is the only way to release my pent up emotion. The general society of our public do not understand our problem. Again, there's that language problem. Neither do they understand how it feels like to be one of the minority. This naturally distresses me, as I am, after all, only human. And the person goes on then to talk about sort of workplace harassment because they were perceived as effeminate and therefore gay. They go on to talk about that people around the office know they have about their problem, and so they ask for some support. So it's a lot of these windows are a real, like, there's one from 75. Could you please put me in touch with any gay folks in Belfast? I get lonely. It's really quite sad, actually. And even thinking about it, it chokes me up a little bit because I've read so many of the letters and they really do stay with you. Here's a map that was found in one of the bundles where at one point, obviously, they were putting up stickers to say where people had been in contact with. And again, we'll come back to that slightly, but I want you to keep that idea of the map and the letters in mind just for the brief remaining time of the presentation. Cara Friend's archive at Prony is described as one of the most popular. I mean, it's nearly 50 years of window into what it used to be like as a society for LGBT people, but also just as a society generally. And it's interesting, it's really one of the highlights of my career with Cara Friend is that we're continuing to add to the archive. So as I say, this year already, we've added 5 more years of letters to the Prony archive. And literally the day after those letters were added, which had sat under my desk for 7 years or whatever, the day after we got those 5 years worth of letters added to Prony, I was showing around a new admin officer in the office and I was going, well, here's some filing cabinets we don't really use. And I pulled out a random drawer and just sort of flicked through them. And then I found 5 more years worth of letters. It's like, okay, we don't go looking for them, but they've come looking for us, it seems. So we're continuing to add. And now we have, well, I'll get on to that actually before I tell you more. One of the ways that we've been exploring the history as well is through Writing the Past, with the LGBT History Festival that was set up in England and sort of grown across other places. So many of you, I imagine, here have been to Writing the Past or have heard of it. One of my former colleagues, Declan, had attended their festival over in England and then brought Writing the Past to Ireland for the first time, and we had it in Belfast. And we've continued to hold Out in the Past every year online during COVID, I think, but now we're back to in person, and we do that in partnership with the Public Records Office and the Ulster Museum, who have both hosted us. And this year the Ulster Museum will host us again, and we'll get to the details of that soon. Previous talks out in the past have included Nadine Gilmore, who many here will know, who gave a talk about activism archives uncovering Cara Friend papers, and as you'll know, also the Heritage Project have also presented out in the past, talking about their work, such as the creation of the documentary or the donation there of that Cara Friend original telephone, which, if you can see on the screen, if you look to the sort of top right of the telephone, there's a little receiver, and that's on a third wire or so that someone can listen in as they guide the trainee in how to answer the helpline. And keep that idea of it, as well as keeping the map and the letters in mind, keep that telephone in mind as well. Well, you can keep it in mind for now, actually. Another way that we've really benefited from the primary source material that's been preserved by Cara Friend is that Dominic Montague, the playwright, working with Paula McFettridge and the great team at Kibosh, managed to go into the archive, look at some of the materials, and out of that, as well as interviews with members of the community, produced this wonderful play called Callings. You can see the map there in the background. You can see some of the newspaper clippings on the table. And this is an imagination of what it must have been like in Belfast, in the Cara Friend office and outside in the community on the very eve of decriminalisation. They did a wonderful job. If you didn't get to see it, we're hoping it will rerun again later this year. I think it's pretty much in the bag, but certainly we'll get details to you, because if you haven't seen it, it's a real treat. And there's a very similar telephone. You can really see in the set design that that Dominic worked with the Cara Friend archive and the materials there, and even this photo itself as well. There's the map, with the pins, the filing cabinets full of letters, the newspaper clippings in the background. They did such a wonderful job, actually. And perhaps the highest praise the play could have got was a Cara Friend volunteer, who will not be named, saying so many times during the play, I could hear someone saying, "That's just like how it was. That's exactly, I remember that." Which is just so, whenever I told them that, they absolutely lit up, because, that's the proof's in the pudding. So out in the past this year will be taking place again. It'll be taking place at the Ulster Museum. Don't worry, you'll get these in an email form as well, but I'm just putting them here in case anybody wants to put them in their diary now. It'll be 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Ulster Museum on Saturday, the 27th of April. We have a wonderful lineup of 6 speakers, including Anthony Donnelly Drummond, who will be giving a talk on some research he's carried out into gay men's experience of the Troubles. We'll also have Queerspace, who will be giving a presentation that will be sort of multifaceted, involving different aspects of their work and their celebrations. We'll have Joe from the Heritage Project, who will be updating you about some of the work of the project and what's going on over the coming years, and others. You'll get the full list soon once it goes live. But there is also something that would be worth noting, which is that after out in the past this year, there will be something separate, which is 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. And it's Queer Britain, who are the museum, the LGBT museum set up in London, where they have things like Oscar Wilde's Jailhouse Door, and they'll actually be presenting. One of them will be presenting at Ulster Museum to tell you all about Queer Britain. So if you don't know much about it, please come along. You'll learn more about the museum itself. But they're actually going to do a story collection workshop from 2 to 5. Everyone who participates will get £15, and they're really just trying to be like, as an LGBT person, it doesn't matter where you're from. They just want to know where you're from and like what that means to you as an LGBT person. They just want to know like who are the LGBT figures here that spark interest and whatnot in you. And they're really just trying to talk to people and hear your thoughts. And I'll stick there's a free Eventbrite thing that I'll stick in the chat for you, just in case anybody's interested. Both will be great events. I know it's a really long day, 10 to 5, but if you can make one or the other, it would be wonderful. If you can make both, all the better. You're all very, very welcome. So just to round off everything, activities and events coming up, because it is the 50th year and it's a year of celebrations. We have a PhD intern who is going to do 6 months part-time work with us. Michael Lawrence, who I believe used to be a frequent attendee of these club meetings. So Michael's going to really provide a vital service, because like the history really is only one aspect of my job, and I wish it was the whole job, but it's not. But Michael's going to help as we prepare. We have like a draft list of plans. We are applying to get a budget, but we'll do our best with whatever monies we have. We're continuing to engage with our partners, such as Joe and Mary Ellen here at the Heritage Project, and others, such as the Queer and I project team over at Queen's. Charlie, I'm in frequent contact with as well. Like we're talking with the museum, possible venues, talking to Prony. So we've got we're working along. The aim is to try and run a series of events throughout the year, including several public talks, hopefully some exhibitions. Support that rerun of Callings in October around which should coincide nicely with the birthday. We're hoping to organize a history symposium in the summer, which will just sort of celebrate because this is part of a bigger whole. You've got the Heritage Project, you've got the Queer and I Project, you've got the working schools, you've got all sorts. The idea of the symposium is to try and bring a lot of this together so that we can celebrate it, analyze it, talk about it, and bring it to a new audience. Hoping to do some workshops and interactive activities, and then I'm really hoping that at some point we can just have a good old knees up and a party just to celebrate all of the great work that has grown out of the last 50 years. But obviously as well, we want to hear from members of the community, so I'd be really interested to hear people's thoughts, and maybe we could look at organizing some engagement workshops even just to get people's thoughts. That was a lot to throw at you. It was probably a little bit scattered in places, but there's my details. Our door's always open. I'm always open to talk to anybody about anything. So that is that's it. Thank you.
Amazing, Adam. Thank you so much. That was really a whistle-stop tour and so much amazing information. And I'm sure people have a lot of questions, hopefully. And the questions usually spark a bit of a discussion as well. If anybody has a question, you can pop them into the chat and I can read them out for you. Or we can feel free to unmute your device and we can ask them one at a time. So I think there's one or two in the chat now already.
I'm on a call, sorry. I'm just putting that in the chat, by the way. Sorry, that Eventbrite. There you go.
Thank you. Okay, so there's no questions as such in the chat yet. Just praise, people saying thank you. That was amazing and very informative and interesting.
Well, I see Tom shared like I mentioned, a lot of the reports are actually digitized through Queen's, so Tom shared a link in the chat there. It's probably good, even if you don't want to look at it now, probably good to copy it and keep it. Or I can email it out to people. Does Nigel have a question? Sorry, his hand's up.
Yes, go ahead, Nigel.
So actually hoping that other folks would have went ahead before me. I'm the chatter box on these sessions. Well, I don't actually have any questions, but I do have to reflect what everyone had to say. But can you hear me okay, yes?
Yes.
So a lot of people have got praise for the presentation, and it's absolutely due, because Cara Friend has been around for a very long time, and so thank you very much, Adam, for that brief presentation. Now, the recent stuff that we have been going through has just been reminiscent of what Cara Friend had to deal with in the first place. So it was largely to do with a gay situation whenever Cara Friend was first established in 1974. So that was all to do with isolation of a particular kind, and that was the queer isolation. Whenever we came out of lockdown, and that meant that everyone was coming out of isolation, we found that problem all over again. So we're getting very adept at this term, recognizing what loneliness is. and what it does to people. And it does have very detrimental effects. Um, Now, you might shout at me for this. I am absolutely not plugging the name of this pub, but I thought, well, seeing as Cara Friend is in the name, and there happens to be a very big sign on the side of this wall besides Charlie's Bar in Enniskillen, I thought it might as well be appropriate to show you all. So let's see if I can get it in view for you all to see. It's probably back to front, but there you go. There are no strangers here, only friends you haven't met yet. WB Yates. So I'm not saying come up to Enniskillen and you'll find friends, but I do actually have one more thing to say, and that's to do with your reference to media, Adam. So you had mentioned, have the media learned anything about their attitudes in particular whenever it had come to the queer community? I can definitely have a personal statement on that. Before I had left school, there was a newspaper clipping that I had secured, and I was very surprised to have come across it because most of the company that I kept and that I had for all of my secondary school throughout all 5 years, hardly anything was to do with anything at all concerning news. It was never really seen until I came across that newspaper clipping, and it was to do with our local park in Dromore in County Down. Now, I wasn't expecting to come across the virility of that, and I didn't know what it meant at the time because we didn't have any exploration of sexual or gender identity in our school. But it hasn't really progressed very far at all. Now, I left school in 2009. So because Cara Friend was, let me see. No, nothing to do with Cara Friend. That newspaper clipping is over 14 years old. So 14 years ago, that sort of attitude was still happening. And it was really just to let people know that they, I'm trying to remember, what did the title of that newspaper clipping say? It said, gays spotted in a nearby park, like as if it was to advise some sort of caution for people to be careful. So it didn't have to be direct, but its impact was nonetheless strong enough. So I would say that the media still has a long way to go, and they have got lots of bad habits. That's all I have to say, unfortunately.
Yeah, can I respond to some of that just then, Joe? Would that be okay?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, on the media front, we just have to look at like the tabloid press today and their coverage of particularly trans, non-binary, and gender diverse identities to see that in many ways they haven't really learned any lessons. They've only really learned what they can and can't get away with. You know, they a lot of the ways that they were talking about, LGBT people, that they were like a seedy sort of secret threat. You never knew, what they were up to, who they were, what's their agenda. I've heard people talk about the trans agenda. And whenever they do, I just say to them, well, that sounds like the gay agenda that I had to listen to people talk about not that long ago, actually. So I really do think there's a, you could do a small event, you could do a full PhD, there's a huge piece of work to be done analyzing the media, past, present. And got to remember, a lot of the journalists actually who were writing some pretty nasty things about our community back in the day, who don't do that anymore, never really got pulled up for it. And nor did their employers. But just on the isolation thing, I think that is something that is very important, actually. There's a lot of services now, like there's a lot of mental health support, there's a lot of youth services, but there's definitely gaps in how we're tackling that. And one of my goals for Cara Friend is very much that when we can figure out the funding and figure out the way to do it, I would very much like to, I'm not making any promises here, obviously, because I'm just one person, but my hope is that we can turn the helpline from a service that sort of sits waiting for someone to contact it to a service whereby people can actually sign up to it. So you could say, like, I would like to be called once a month or once a week or once a fortnight, and just, have someone have a chat with me, tell me what's coming up in terms of events in the community, and just, have someone there to speak to. And that's something that people could sign up for as long as they want. And that's, then we're not sitting waiting like, why haven't they called in a while? Are they okay? Are they not? I would like to try and get it to like a proactive type of a service. But I think that there is more and more recognition of the importance of tackling isolation, and we're really we're doing more than we probably ever have, but I think there's still a lot more that we could do. And if I could just answer Molly's question about themes that came out of the different decades, there's nothing really, Molly, that jumps immediately to mind when you ask that question. I'm sure if I went and thought about it, maybe that it would, but I'm so used to recently to looking at sort of the earlier days that I probably haven't got as much of a grasp of the 90s, the 2000s, and and then you get into my personal lived experience, which is slightly different. Like, but yeah, I could probably do more looking at like the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, because a lot changes with the information age. That's a big theme there, like a lot changes with the advent of the internet and whatnot. But I wish I had a better answer for you, Molly. Sorry, but and I wish I had more time to spend actually studying them. But maybe that's something that we could look at. One of the things that I have actually, as well as the PhD support from Michael Lawrence, is there's a student called Sophia who was going to do her 30-day placement with Cara Friend, but switched from studying history to studying Irish, and so didn't do that. But she's actually said, well, because I looked at the materials with her to see if she wanted to do the placement before she switched subject, and she's come back to me now and said, like, I know I'm not doing the history anymore, but I'm so interested in the materials that you showed me that I want to volunteer with Cara Friend. And so we've sort of sat down and said, well, how about you go through all the old, like go through each annual report and try and pick out the main key points and information from each report. And my hope is that I can work with Sophia so that come the anniversary, the 50th anniversary in October, we might be in a position to launch like a diluted history of Cara Friend booklet or something like that talks about maybe how that's changed over the decades.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks for your questions, Nigel and Molly. So Adam, the helpline is still up and running. Is it still busy?
So most calls now come through during the daytime, and that's just the way a lot of people are operating. We also get a lot more emails than we used to. We've had a bit of an issue with the helpline over the years. It's not the format that it uses. I don't think really. How can I say this? There are just modernizations that need to happen to it in the way that people communicate in this day and age. A lot of the time we would have volunteers who wouldn't be getting enough calls to
The experience?
keep them interested, even, because like just not a lot of people are calling in the evening time anymore. I don't know why that is, by the way. It completely baffles me, but most of the people who call us now for helpline calls call during the daytime, and that's usually, like, we have a rule in the office: anyone who's not helpline trained can't pick up the phone, and so we try and get everybody helpline trained. But like sometimes I'll be in the middle of working on something and I'll answer the phone, and that's a 45-minute helpline call. But that's just the way people are phoning. You can't say to me, you can't say to them, phone back later. It's not how a helpline call works. But we are getting a lot, like, and it's, by and large, it's people. It's really hard to actually nail down because it's so diverse. Like, I've had helpline calls from children who, like, young people who've called up and said, like, I want to come out to my family and friends, but I don't know how. And then you maybe, like, you'll support them by giving them signposts to resources. You'll have a chat with them about it, all that. And then a couple of weeks later, you have a phone call from a parent saying, my kids just come out. What do I do? And it's interesting that, I think it's interesting in that sort of way that a lot of the calls, you're not really like saying, well, there's some bars you can go to and we'd love to get you integrated into the community that way. It really is more like, well, what are your needs? Here are the list of services and organizations that can support you. So it's interesting in that sort of sense in a way. But yeah, the number of people who are contacting us from outside of Northern Ireland is growing very fast, actually, and that's a new challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So does anyone have any more questions?
One thing, just I would say one thing's really good is actually and I think this will be borne out is when we're looking back on things 10, 15, 20 years from now. So many LGBT people are getting engaged when they're in, like, they're 12 to 16 years old, or they're like 16 to 19 years old. and they're coming in really early. They're getting engaged in youth services. They're getting engaged with mental health services. They're getting all sorts of, like, they're building up that peer support and that community support, so that, like, they don't need to be on the phone to us the way that maybe people used to in the past when they had no other options. They couldn't talk to anybody. The phone call, the Cara Friend was the only outlet they had. Now people have so many different outlets, actually, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good positive change.
There's only one thing that I can say. Sorry for speaking up without raising the hand. Um, Adam absolutely hit the nail on the head, but I'm sure that this is a reflective experience for everybody. Um, having been working out here, I say working, I've been a volunteer for a couple of years now with Fermanagh Pride. There's there's a unique aspect as well of isolation whenever it comes to the rural community as well. And only thanks to some initiative from Mid Ulster Pride, they have been in the works to try and establish a rural community pride organization, which has never ever happened before. But just following up on that, I never thought that we would be, as a pride organization, responsible for such exceptional situations that involve people's sanity, welfare, and possibly even their lives. Because although we're meant to have specialist services out here in the rural countryside to help people who have got the most extraordinary situations, the services are not out here, and that's largely due to the budget cuts that had happened to all of the Section 75 services. And because of that, sometimes we are the organization that people tend to call. Now, we are not an organization that's responsible for helping people to overcome thoughts of suicide, but we get those phone calls anyway. And because we're not trained, the best we can do is just reference them onward. We tend to get them a lot just prior to whenever our events are about to happen. But on a happier note, regarding callings, I can attest that it is absolutely worth it. I loved it so much that I drove from Enniskillen to Omagh so that I could watch it twice. That's how good I found the film. So if it's coming near you, then absolutely get those tickets and bring a friend. Cara Friend.
And just on that point, just on the point about, yeah, and like one thing that really blows me away, that I found in one of the early letters, was someone wrote a letter in the 70s, really early on. Someone wrote to Doug Sobey and said, Doug, thank you so much for having us round to your home, and introducing us to other people like me. I've actually met someone, we have a lot of shared interests, and we're going to be meeting again soon. And that told me right away that, like, a lot of the early volunteers were opening up their homes to strangers and using those as community spaces. And a lot of these, they're not like mental health professionals, but that's the stuff you're having to deal with. Cara Friend does have a community development remit, Nigel, and so, like, if you and your volunteers were interested in, we can certainly look at, like, training, like suicide first aid training and things like that for your team. If money is an issue, I'm sure Cara Friend might be able to find a budget for that, and help you organize that.